Hi, welcome to Constitutional Chats, hosted by me, Janine Turner,
and Cathy Gillespie,
with students
Dakare, Chatman,
and me, Tova, Kaplan.
Join us as we discuss hot topic issues with constitutional experts. It's sponsored by Constituting America. Welcome to Constitutional Chats. Today we're going to talk about our hot topic, which is the 19th Amendment, with our most prestigious and absolutely fabulous constitutional expert, Dr. Shogun. So thanks for joining us. Okay, so now I'm going to introduce, myself. I'm an actress, Janine Turner. I guess if you want to know a little bit about my work, you can go to JanineTurner.com. I'm also the founder and co-president of Constituting America. Cathy Gillespie is co-president of Constituting America and one of the 16 private citizens serving on the U.S. Semi-Centennial Commission, helping organize the celebration of our country's 250th birthday in 2026. Say hello, Cathy.
Hi, everyone. Thanks for being here. We're very excited about today's program.
Tova Kaplan is the extraordinary, our National Youth Director. She's 16 years old and lives in Chicago, Illinois. She runs our National Youth Advisory Council like a CEO of a major corporation. She's so incredibly talented. She is our National Youth Director, as I said. She's also the 3-time winner of the We the Future contest. She is an entrepreneur. She won the first time for an entrepreneur when she was just in middle school, where she created a marketing plan for Constituting America. And then the second time she won for PSA. She started it and wrote it and directed it. It was fabulous. It's up at constitutingamerica.org. And it says, know your rights, read the Constitution. It's a great little piece. And then she won again for STEM, where she created an app. And I'm very excited. I hope when Tova's out of school and finishes school, because she's only 16, we hope to have our app up, which will be really fantastic. She is passionate about educating and empowering young people to use their constitutional rights. Say hello, Tova.
Glad to be here. Thanks for coming.
There she is. And Dakare Chatman, he's our extraordinary Constituting America student ambassador. He's 16 years old as well and is currently a full-time high school and college student in South Carolina. He has won Constituting America's We the Future contest twice, once for a public service announcement where he reminded viewers the Constitution is an American thing, so know it, and then again for a short film, Man on the Street. He's also actively involved in our National Youth Advisory Board with Tova. We're very proud of him and Tova. He's a working actor seen most recently in HBO's The Righteous Gemstones and in Netflix's Outer Banks, which was released April 15th. And Dakare wishes to be an actor. He'll be a brilliant one, just like Tova. I think Tova would like to be an actress too, or go into politics. And Dakare would also like to go into politics, but he says, really, you must be an actor to be a politician, and that's so true. Say hello, Dakare.
Hello, everyone. Thanks for being here.
Last but certainly not least, our special constitutional expert for our hot topic today, which is the 19th Amendment, Dr. Shogun. Dr. Shogun, she's also a professor, wears many hats. Professor Shogun has taught American politics at Yale. She also got her degree and master's at Yale. She also has taught American politics at George Mason University, Georgetown University, and the University of Pennsylvania, all fantastic universities. In addition to serving as vice chair of the Women's Suffrage Centennial Commission, which is fabulous, Dr. Shogun is senior vice president and director of the David Rubenstein National Center for White House History and is an adjunct professor at Georgetown University. And more about Dr. Shogun, she has served for 11 years at the Library of Congress, including as deputy director of the Congressional Research Service. And she's the author of mystery novels set in Washington, D.C. Her latest novel, Larceny in the Library, is available for pre-order on Amazon now. I love mysteries. Dr. Shogun, thank you so much for taking time out of your day to be with us. It's really our honor.
Well, thank you so much. I'm really looking forward to it. And one thing I love to talk about is the 19th Amendment and women's quest for the right to vote. So I look forward to everyone's questions and having a good conversation today.
Well, awesome. And I want to learn more about your books before we wrap up here today. So Tova, I'm going to let you ask the first question.
Sure. So I guess right off the bat, you know, we're constituting America. We're always concerned with the Constitution. So I was wondering how the suffragists used the Constitution to justify their argument for the women's right to vote, and how they used their constitutional rights like freedom of speech or freedom of the press in order to argue for their right to vote.
Right. That's a good question. And I know this crowd will appreciate some of the different approaches and different strategies that the suffragists had to use over time. One thing to remember is that most historians think of the women's suffrage movement as starting in 1848 in the United States. It was the longest lasting social movement in United States history, starting in 1848 with the Seneca Falls Convention, where the first petition for women's right to vote was actually signed by those in attendance. And then, of course, it ended in 1920 when the 19th Amendment was certified into the Constitution on August 26th. That's 72 years in which women petitioned and asked the government and fought for the right to vote. One thing I'll say, and I'm glad you asked the question in that way, because sometimes there's a perception, I think, of women's suffrage that, women kind of walked around and, they're kind of little fancy outfits, and I'm wearing my white blazer today, and white is symbolic of the movement, and the yellow roses, that they walked around and, held up a couple signs and, politely asked for the right to vote. And eventually the 19th Amendment came into being. And that's really not exactly what happened. It was a very, very difficult fight for the right to vote. And you can imagine that the women who started the movement in the 1840s and the 1850s, the early suffragists that many people know, like Susan B. Anthony or Elizabeth Cady Stanton, they were unfortunately not alive when the 19th Amendment actually became part of the Constitution. They died more than a decade before 1920, so they never actually got to see their dream realized of women having the right to vote. Throughout the entire, 72 years of the movement, certainly women exercised freedom of speech, even at something as radical as you can imagine in 1848, where the first women's rights convention took place in Seneca Falls in upstate New York. Just the fact that those women were able to gather together, and Frederick Douglass, who also attended, that those women and Frederick Douglass were able to gather together and talk about the idea of women having more rights in society, including the right to vote. That was protected, of course, by the Constitution and the freedom of speech. Now, where some things get a little bit complicated is more with the freedom of petition or the freedom of assembly. And certainly women did come together and exercise those rights for a long time. At the end of the movement, so we're talking very close to when the amendment actually passed. So starting in 1917, the movement had gone through several different phases and many different types of leaders. But women started, and this is one of my favorite parts of the story, but women started petitioning the government, and petitioning by actually protesting or picketing the White House in 1917. They were women suffragists were the first group to ever picket the White House in the history of the United States. No other group had actually decided they would take signs and stand in front of the White House, which is very common today. As someone who works near the White House at the White House Historical Association, I just have to look out my window across Lafayette Park, and I can see protesters, of course, before the pandemic hit, I could see protesters any given day standing near the White House or the White House fence to make their beliefs known. But the first group to actually do that were the suffragists. And they wanted to draw more attention to their cause. It was a media ploy more than anything else, to draw more attention. And it worked for a long period of time until it didn't work, until after the United States entered World War I in particular in 1917, and opinions of women actually protesting in front of the White House changed. And then women started to be arrested in front of the White House. And in total, 168 women actually were arrested in front of the White House, and many served time in either prison or jail because of doing this. The formal charge was, I think, blocking traffic or blocking the sidewalk, something like that, obstructing traffic, obstructing the sidewalk, which of course they weren't doing. They were simply standing there. They weren't actually moving back and forth, standing there with their signs. So they were certainly exercising their constitutional freedoms, but it was interpreted for a good period of time that their constitutional freedoms were not being protected. And so that's a big part of the story. However, it kind of worked against the anti-suffragists, because eventually public opinion turned against the fact that a lot of these women were being arrested and put into prison, and it actually ended up working in their favor.
Wow, that's amazing. Dakare, what is your question?
Hello. I know that Tova and I like to always ask, how it is globally, when we're talking about these things. So my question to you is, on a global scale, was the United States the first country to allow women the right to vote, or were there people who were ahead of us globally?
Right, that's a good question. We weren't even close. We were definitely not one of the first democracies to allow women to vote. The first democracy that's usually popularly stated was New Zealand, and that was in the 1890s, so quite a bit of time before the United States in 1920. Australia was soon to follow, very near New Zealand, so that sort of makes a lot of sense. And as far as European countries go, Finland was the first European country to give women the right to vote. That was in 1906. By 1917, 1918, after World War I was already in full force, a good portion of Europe had already given women the right to vote. And then the United States would follow with a constitutional amendment in 1920. It is important to keep in mind that women had the right to vote in some of the Western states earlier than 1920, but that was only state by state, and it did not necessarily always guarantee women the right to vote in every election. For example, some states would allow women to vote in local elections, like school board elections or town mayor elections, but would not let them to vote in for their member of Congress or for president. So it was not uniform even in some of those states where women were allowed to vote in the western part of the country. But the United States was probably, I've heard it described as far as all the democracies in the world, was about in the middle for allowing women to the right to vote. So not one of the first, but not the last.
Cathy, what's your question?
Well, thank you, Dr. Shogan, for being with us today. I loved what you said about the fact that this was such a hard-fought battle, really, for women to gain the right to vote. And there were just so many stories that go into this that are fascinating to me. One was how much one vote made a difference. I think I read that at least one time when the amendment passed the U.S. House, it passed the U.S. House by one vote. But then when it finally passed Tennessee, when Tennessee was the final state to ratify, there were a couple of instances where one vote played a big difference. And I think you and I had exchanged a couple of emails about the story of Harry Bern. And I'd love if you just tell a little bit of that story, because I think the students and the listeners would find that fascinating.
Right. So, of course, in 1920, as you said, the amendment had to pass the House and the Senate first, which it had at different times throughout the House, but it had not passed the Senate. So it finally passed the House and the Senate in the summer of 1919. So that then moved the amendment on to the next stage of the ratification process, which was going to the states. At that point in time, there were 48 states in the United States, and according to the Constitution, 3/4 of the states needed to approve the amendment before it would be part of the Constitution. So that meant 36 states needed to ratify. And in the beginning, it went pretty fast. A lot of the states that had been supported, a lot of the Western states who had already had some version of voting rights, they quickly ratified the amendment, and other states moved along in due course. But at the end, it started to get harder and harder. And in fact, in a few states, actually, the amendment failed in the state legislature. So a lot of people thought it had really come down to Tennessee, because Tennessee was a likely state, a state where ratification was thought of as possible, that actually the legislature would vote to include the amendment in the Constitution. If you read, there's a great book out there by an author, journalist, Elaine Weiss, and she talks a lot about this last couple of weeks in Tennessee before the amendment is actually voted on in the legislature. But you're right, it turned out to be a very, very close count. It was actually tied 48-48. And it came down to really, as you said, one vote. And it does underscore the notion that one vote can matter and does matter. And the youngest legislature actually in Tennessee, his name was Harry Bern. He was only 24 years old, and he was new to the legislature. People thought that Harry Bern was going to vote against the amendment, because previously he had actually worn a red rose on the floor of the legislature, which meant you were an anti. If you wore a yellow rose, then you were pro-suffrage. And they did this to do vote counts, and because they could count the color of the rose that you were actually wearing on your lapel. And so Harry Bern had previously worn a red rose, so people thought he was a no vote. But he apparently that morning received a letter from his mother, who asked him to vote yes on suffrage, because she thought it was the right thing to do and that women deserved the right to vote. And apparently he had the letter with him when he walked down to vote. And he decided that day, unbeknownst to the speaker or any of the leadership, that he was going to vote for women's suffrage, and he did. And I think it's also important that how critical things are to be on the right side of history. And Harry Bern was clearly on the right side of history. Women were going to have the right to vote. This was happening all across the country, and it was also happening all across the world. The question was it going to happen in 1920, or were women going to have to wait another year or two in the United States? But Harry Bern clearly, as we would think, made the right decision, and has been very much venerated and commemorated for that brave decision. It's not really clear that his constituents were supportive of women voting, but he decided that he was going to vote his conscience that day.
Can you tell me the two states, or the few states, that actually did not pass women's suffrage?
I wish I could, I should be, they were northern states, northeastern states. I think one was Connecticut. I'd have to go back and look.
That would be really, Lisa, maybe you can look that up for us, because
yeah.
That would be really interesting to know, wouldn't it? Which were the states that did not ratify women's suffrage? I know that other states, like Wyoming, and I think certain other states, had already passed it in their state before it became.
That's correct.
I would love states that said no.
And most southern states didn't take up the amendment for many, many years, unfortunately, even after it was ratified and became part of the Constitution. So even,
do you know which southern states those were?
Like Virginia, for example, did not take up the amendment for many, many years. Mississippi, other southern states did not actually take up the amendment and ratify it in a symbolic way. It was already part of the Constitution, right? When Tennessee voted, then it became the law of the land. But other states dragged it on for a long time to actually take a vote on ratification.
They had to enact it in their states.
They did,
but
but
they didn't ratify it. It'd be interesting to know which those states are too. Okay,
All right, thank you. This is so fascinating. Like I know that a lot of times when people learn it in school, they kind of learn, okay, you know, for a lot of American history, women couldn't vote, and suddenly there was like a flashback activity, then we could vote, and then the story's over, like book closed. But I was wondering what happened like immediately after women gained the right to vote, because I can't imagine that all that opposition, like, you know, centuries of opposition would just dissolve once the Constitution was changed. So once women officially had the right to vote, what happened to that kind of opposition to their voting rights? Did women still face barriers to voting? And I guess what's the continuation of the story that we don't usually hear about?
Yeah, that's a good question. So I know this because one of my friends wrote a book called A Century of Women's Voting that's recently been published. And what she did was study voting patterns of women after 1920, so after the amendment was passed. The first several decades after the amendment passed, women did vote, but they voted in much lower numbers than men. And you can understand that for a lot of reasons, because there wasn't a culture of voting. It was a new activity. Some women were anti-suffragists that were actually opposed to women voting. So they certainly weren't going to necessarily exercise their right to vote. So women's turnout was not particularly high for several decades after 1920, fairly low and depressed. Usually women voted not any differently than men in that time frame. So the analysis that has been able to be done. When the first time we see women voting in equal or greater proportions to men is 1980. That's when the tide starts to turn. And of course, there are more women in the population, voting eligible women, than men. So when women start to turn out at higher numbers, then actually the number of women voters greatly, at this point in time, exceeds men. And women vote in greater proportion than men, and have pretty consistently since 1980. Why 1980? There's a lot of questions about that, but most scholars think that's because it was 60 years after 1920. And if you do the math and you think about it, that means that's an entire lifetime after the 19th Amendment. So women that started to vote in 1980, all of them had been living when women's suffrage was part of the Constitution. You can do the math. If you had to be 18 to vote, you can understand that. And so it really took an entire lifetime of having women being born after the 19th Amendment to really change political culture and political practices to where it was accepted and part of political or civic life for women to vote in similar proportions to men. So it's a long time.
Lisa, you have our answer?
I have the states, not all of these rejected it, but these are the states that did not vote to ratify. Connecticut, Vermont, Delaware, Maryland, Virginia, Alabama, Florida, South Carolina, Georgia, Louisiana, North Carolina, and Mississippi.
Wow. Say those very slowly again.
So some of these did vote to reject, some of them didn't, and just never voted on, or never, made a decision. Connecticut, Vermont, Delaware, Maryland, Virginia, Alabama, Florida, South Carolina, Georgia, Louisiana, North Carolina, and Mississippi.
So you have a sprinkling of northern states up there, what I consider northern, being a Texas gal, but a lot of southern too. Very interesting. Thank you, Lisa. That's really interesting. Isn't that interesting, Dr. Shogun?
Yes, it is. And it's kind of an interesting mix. People often ask, well, why did people oppose women voting? I mean, why would they actually oppose for women to be not voting, particularly when it comes to 1920? There were a lot of reasons. There were some women and men who just viewed that that wasn't women's roles. The women played important roles in society, but voting and political and public life wasn't one of them. So women should exercise any influence or judgment that they had, but more behind the scenes in civic organizations and other in religious organizations, but not necessarily as part of the voting public, because politics was sometimes, you know, viewed certainly as like a dirty business and something not necessarily that would be appropriate for women to participate in. It wasn't dignified. It would be almost in some ways beneath them to enter that sphere. So there was that portion. But then there was, you know, there's political and interest group reasons for why other groups opposed women being able to vote. Women were viewed as, if they entered the voting population, that they were going to support more liberal labor laws, particularly for children. There were not laws at that time to protect child labor or prevent children from working, right? And they viewed that if women entered the voting electorate, that they would elect more legislators that would be in favor of passing laws that would be in particular protective for children and what we would call children's rights today. So a lot of manufacturing union interests were against women entering the workforce because they didn't know what was going to happen on the other side. Another big opposition to women voting was the liquor industry, because they viewed women as as anti-alcohol and pro-temperance. And they thought that if you put more women in the voting population, then there would be more restrictive laws about alcohol. And actually they were right, because as you know, there was a prohibition amendment that was enacted after 1920. So really the liquor industry was correct in that.
That's really interesting to hear all the history. I think the second part of your answer is politically very fascinating, but the first part about, I think sometimes we're so rash in modern day to judge people of history without really understanding what the environment was like and the way people thought back then. I mean, we just take for granted that everybody had the science and the knowledge and all the things that we have today. I mean, in the revolutionary era, they thought thunder was God. I mean, they didn't understand any of the dynamics. They didn't even understand electricity. It's just really interesting to before we judge, to understand kind of what was going on in certain situations, not in all. So that's really fascinating that you told us all that. And you know, women also still really couldn't get an education very easily. And I know Texas A&M, Cathy, didn't allow women to win. 1960s?
Yeah, late 60s, early 70s.
Mm-hmm. Right. So I know that I've written extensively actually on this era, and I know that women had a hard time. I mean, I think it was not until Belva Lockwood helped pass a bill in Congress, women didn't have the right to their children. The husband could just sell their children for servitude if they wanted to. If there was a divorce, they couldn't get it, but if they did get a divorce, the husband got the children. And there were so many. A woman, if she was married, couldn't buy any property. She could if she was divorced, but she couldn't if she were married. It was still so incredibly archaic, and so that's really, really fascinating to understand all the dynamics that were behind it, and especially in the educational aspect. Geez. Okay, I believe it's Dakare's turn. Yes, Dakare?
Yes, ma'am. You know, I find this so fascinating because women started so much later than men did, and look at you guys. Y'all are all so much better than us. It's hilarious to me. But my question is, what are we looking at as far as numbers now, Dr. Shogan, when we're looking at women being civically engaged today? I know that we see a lot of women in the House now. You know, I even noticed that when, you know, we turn 18, a lot of my friends that are females, they are like so excited to vote. And then a lot of the males are just kind of like, okay, yeah, maybe, you know. So what are those statistics?
Yeah, certainly. I mean, as far as, for example, turnout in a presidential election, I don't know if it's 53. I think it's 53 or 54% of the actual electorate is going to be women. So this is why when you hear about, the women's vote is really important. Well, that's because it's the majority of the vote, and that's why it's incredibly important. As far as civic participation goes, there's high degrees of civic participation amongst women. There always has been. And in fact, a lot of the women historically who, it wasn't like women just became suffragists, right? They woke up one day and, oh, okay, I'm going to go join the local suffrage movement. The reason why they became suffragists was that they got recruited into the suffrage movement because they were part of a civic organization. So like the National Federation of Women's Clubs, or actually the Women's Christian Temperance Union, WCTU, was a big recruiter for women's suffrage. So they used, this is a great lesson to be learned for women in politics. Skills are transferable. So women learn skills sometimes that aren't necessarily like political skills, but they might be the head of their PTA, right? Their local PTA. Or, and because they're the head of the local PTA, they get recruited to run for school board. And because they're successful in school board, before you know it, they're in the state legislature, and so on and so forth. Or perhaps they lead some sort of civic group to get better stoplights in their neighborhood because it's unsafe for, it's an unsafe situation. And the skills that are learned through doing that actually propel them into situations in which they will either become involved in politics or run an elected office. So that transferability of skills from the civic domain, the nonpartisan civic domain, into the elected political domain are really important for women and play a big story. For if you look at a lot of the women politicians that are out there, female politicians that are out there, like you said, in Congress, women that have run for president, I guarantee you, if you went back in their history and found out where did they get started, a lot of them got started in civic or other or religious organizations that then led them down this particular path.
Are looking after their children, wanting to look after their children, starts PTA, as you were saying, like that. You said that 53% of the electorate is women, but how many actually show up to vote? Like when people actually vote, is it always 53% of the women or more when they show up to vote? Are men, or just there's a broader amount of women who are registered, but when it actually comes to voting, does that stick? Like in general elections, when did that change? My father always seems to think it changed around Clinton's time, but do you understand? I mean, it's kind of a bizarre question, but you said 53%, but I'm wondering if people actually vote, if that sticks.
So the more women turn out starting around 1980, that's when actually women are outnumbering men in the actual electorate that shows up in 1980. But for your question about Clinton in the 1990s, that's what we typically view, and you might hear this a lot on TV about the gender gap. That is more about who women are voting for, not just the fact that they're coming out to vote. It's who they're voting for. And that's when women start to diverge from male voting patterns and start to establish a different and distinct voting pattern than men about who they vote for. So there's two questions that particularly like my colleagues that are experts in voting behavior think about when they're studying women and voting. One is turnout, right? So how many women are coming out to vote? And like you said, the percentage of women coming out to vote. And women have been outpacing men in that regard since 1980, exceeding the number of men in the actual voting electorate that are actually coming out and voting at the polling booths. And maybe by mail this time, we'll find out. But 1992 is important because that's when women's voting behavior, who they're voting for, starts to diverge from men. So those are the two important points.
That's really fascinating. Fascinating to me. Fascinating that men don't show up to vote. I don't really understand that, but that's whatever. Okay, Cathy, your turn.
Well, just to take it back into history just a little bit, as I was researching and actually trying to do some social media, I didn't want to call our great women by the wrong name. So I was looking, do I call them suffragists or suffragettes? And I noticed that there was a sort of a difference of meaning to those two terms. And I was wondering if you could explain that a little bit, what the connotation, I guess, between suffragist and suffragette, and which we should really be using.
Yes, absolutely. So in Britain, actually, the term suffragette was used as in a derogatory way. So it was viewed to make women seem demeaning or not as sophisticated as men by using the suffragette connotation. So women in the United States wanted to be called suffragists, which it does not have that same negative connotation. And whenever suffragette, the term suffragette was used in the United States, it was done in an attempt to be more demeaning towards the suffragists. So in Britain, it was a term used originally derogatory, tried to be brought over to the United States as a way to diminish or demean women and women themselves in the United States who were looking for the right to vote, seeking the 19th Amendment, called themselves suffragists. So we in the Women's Suffrage Centennial Commission, we only call those women suffragists. We never call them suffragettes.
But it wasn't a gender thing as much as it just already had a negative connotation abroad, right?
That's correct.
Is that what you're saying?
That's correct.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
Kathy, do we have any listener who has a question, or a viewer, or do you have a follow-up before I go back to Tova and Dakare?
Yeah, we definitely do. Mary Croxton asked, what happened to the National American Women's Suffrage Association and the National Women's Party? Do they still exist, or did they kind of work themselves out of a job?
Well, that's a good question. NASA eventually became the League of Women Voters eventually. Okay. So that organization transitioned into the nonpartisan League of Women Voters that we know today. And the National Women's Party existed for a very, very long time, for many, many years after the amendment passed. Alice Paul was the head of the National Women's Party, and really she pivoted right after the 19th Amendment and soon took up the cause of the Equal Rights Amendment. And so the National Women's Party became the party advocating for the Equal Rights Amendment for many, many, many decades.
Well, and that takes us to another audience question. And if you don't know the status on this, please don't worry. But we do have an audience member who's asking, where does the Equal Rights Amendment stand today?
Yeah, that's tough. I'm not, I've read a lot of articles about it, but I'm not an expert. And I think I actually think this would be something to look into, because as I understand it, there's a constitutional debate right now about whether or not, if more states ratify the ERA, whether those ratifications will be actually accepted or certified as part of making the amendment as part of the Constitution, or has the time expired for those ratifications to actually count, and does the process need to start all over again? And if that was the case, it would have to go through the House, the Senate again, and through the entire ratification process. So as I understand that, that's probably something that the courts are going to have to decide.
Is there an expiration date on proposed constitutional amendments? I didn't know that. That's interesting.
Yeah, there is. There's oftentimes when actually the amendment is written, there can actually be a date that's included. And I understand that the ERA, that there was a date that was included originally. But the question is whether those dates are constitutional or not.
Right, because that's not in the Constitution.
No,
right?
no, not in the Constitution. So the question is,
yeah, it doesn't say there.
Yeah, by including a date, that's constitutional or not. And I don't know. I guess we might find out.
Tova?
Great, thank you. This whole thing is just so fascinating. Thank you so much for filling in all these gaps in history that we never learn about. It's so, I totally am going to think about it a different way. So I was wondering, when you were answering Dakare's question about the suffrage movement from a global perspective, you were kind of giving off the dates that other countries introduced suffrage. So a lot of the dates, or almost all the dates, were in the early 1900s. You know, I think one or two you said were in 1890s, but all of them were kind of bunched up around the early 1900s. And I was wondering why that was. Why didn't countries have it before then? Why wasn't it much later? Why did they all seem to be in this very specific time after I guess, millennia of not having women voting. Why that specific historical time?
That's a good question. I think that at that period in time, I will go back to what we were talking about with the civic organizations and women's participation in those spheres of public life. I think in the 1870s, the 1880s, even the 1890s, remember that's the eclipsing of the Victorian era, which is primarily in Europe, but also influences the United States as well. There's a particular conception of womanhood and being female and what that means. Education starts to be more accepted for women, but women receive educations not necessarily to be involved in society or taking jobs, except for teachers. A lot of women are becoming teachers at that point in time. Or social workers, or the early precursors of social workers. But women are being educated so they can be better mothers. It's called educated motherhood, which is viewed as actually very, very important and critical for society. But it takes a longer period of time culturally for there to be acceptance beyond women's sphere as extending beyond the family and the private sphere. That actually that women can be, there starts to be a movement around this time that women are public mothers, that they're not only the mothers of their own children or their own the people in their own family, their own private family, but women have to be public mothers for society at large. They have to bring the qualities of motherhood and their education and their own preferences to the public at large. But that view doesn't start until we enter the 20th century. So in the early 1900s, it just takes a period of time. There's just very antiquated views of what women's role will be in society up until that point. So you have to wait until those things actually change. What really helps women, though, at the very end, of course, which really tips it over the scale. I mean, a lot of people think it's Alice Paul and her protesting and picketing in front of the White House and other tactics, which certainly helped and certainly were important. But women in World War I were also very involved in the war effort, right? Because women become nurses in World War I. And as we all know, there was also a pandemic that hit the world in 1918, the Spanish flu. And women as nurses also played a huge role during the Spanish flu. So women started stepping out in a professional sense and playing important professional roles in society, primarily as nurses and in the war effort. Also, women in World War I took over some of the factory jobs as men went and fought over in Europe. And that really changed the tide of how people started to think about women and their roles in society. And that view of women started to expand outside of the private sphere and into the public. And a lot of people thought that women were so patriotic during World War I and the pandemic that they had played such an important role that they then deserved certainly the right to vote.
You know, Dr. Shogan, Dr. Shogan, that's really fascinating what you just said. And if I could stair step on what you just said. First of all, it's going to be really interesting, I think, as you talk about the movements, the sort of cultural movements take time. It's going to be interesting to see the effect of mothers not raising their children directly and the government as a whole raising children, women of the world raising the children. I think it's going to be interesting to see what the effects of that are like 10, 20, 30 years down the road. And we don't know that yet. But also it's Tova, to answer your question a little bit, if you think about the course of history, first we had the revolution, right? And so then we were floundering, trying to get the government going. And so we get the government going and everyone's just trying to be an American, and it follows with what Dr. Shogan was saying about being a good mother. I think women were very concerned about raising great patriots, and this was their mission because the revolutionary fervor was so strong. Then we had the Civil War, right? So we couldn't actually fight for women's suffrage during the Civil War. And I read something with all my research that where women are saying, why can't we vote? Why can't we vote? Why can't we vote? And they said, this isn't your time. the time right now is for slavery. We have to address slavery, and then it will be your time. And of course, after that, though, right after, you know, we did have a few years, but we just had, I think we had a gap there. But people were just trying to recover from the war, from the Civil War, which was so incredibly devastating, and get their feet going with that. And then we had, as Dr. Shogan was saying, the pandemic, and then we had World War I. So it just seems, doesn't it, Dr. Shogan? And I know we have to let you go and wrap up here, but it just seems like that was the time. There was just so many other phases that we had to address before.
Right.
It just seemed like it was evolving, kind of as a current underneath, because women certainly in the Civil War were wanting to vote, but it just, all these other things kept being thrust of issues they had to do.
I mean, race is important. We haven't talked about that yet. Race played a role in several parts of the movement, but certainly played a very big part of the movement when the 15th Amendment was being considered, because early suffragists like Susan B. Anthony, Elizabeth Cady Stanton, and others were abolitionists to start out, okay? And they were proponents of African Americans being able to vote. In this case, African American men being able to vote. They were friends with Frederick Douglass and other leading Black thought leaders at the time. They were ran in the same circles. So they were, in case of Susan B. Anthony, very good friends with Frederick Douglass for their entire lives. But they split over the 15th Amendment because, of course, the suffragists wanted women to be included. If there was going to be one amendment about voting, they wanted it to be on the basis of race and sex. That's what they wanted the 15th Amendment. But as the 15th Amendment rolled out, it was decided that it would only be about race and not about sex, because they could not put together a winning coalition that would actually approve of both race and sex in the amendment. And as a result, women in the suffrage movement split. Some women who were pro 15th Amendment, for the opportunity for African American men to have the chance to vote, the opportunity and the right to vote. And then other women in the suffrage movement who are against the 15th Amendment, not because they were against African American men from voting, but because they were being excluded, they viewed, from the amendment, and the amendment was flawed. They correctly realized, though, those women, you have to keep this in mind, they thought this was the one vehicle that was going, the 15th Amendment, about voting. And if they weren't on it, if women weren't on it, it was going to be a long time before another voting amendment would actually be enacted and included into the Constitution. And it turned out they were right. That was 1870. Women waited 50 more years for the right to vote after that. So they were right in that sense, for sure.
Really love hearing all that, Dr. Shogan, the way you piece all that together. And that's really, because I think we've had that numerous times. We have 5 minutes left for Dr. Shogan. Yes, or 4 actually. How we piece this together, you know, that the 15th Amendment wouldn't pass. You wouldn't be able to get enough votes for the 15th Amendment. So you had to deal with that crisis at hand. See, Tova and Dakare, it's really interesting to understand how history works. You know, what those I think, Dr. Shogan, are the lessons of history, why history is so important, and people need to understand, and it needs to be taught in schools, because otherwise people have a myopic view of the situations, and they don't understand the aspects of history and how we can stair step on that and I don't know, address it and utilize it and not judge it, I think, as well too. Really, really interesting. I know you have to go because you're being summoned for very bigger and more important things to do today. Is there anything you'd like to say in closing? I know we're all so grateful that this was really a terrific segment, and we're just honored to have you with us today. And I know everyone can individually say something. Thank you. Dakare has his hand up, but she has to leave in 3 minutes, Dakare.
Sorry, I just have to ask, what is the commission doing for the 100 years?
Thank you. Thanks for that question. So I am the vice chair of the Women's Suffrage Centennial Commission, which is the commission that was created by Congress to help commemorate and celebrate the 100th anniversary of the 19th Amendment, which will, of course, occur on August 26, 2020. So we have a lot of things planned. Of course, we've had to pivot because we had a lot of things planned that we cannot necessarily execute during a global pandemic, but a lot of fun things coming up to look out for. We will be lighting up a lot of government buildings on August 26, 2020 in suffrage colors. We're currently underway negotiating with the National Park Service and the Department of Interior to light up Mount Rushmore at the end of August and early September with images of suffragists on the other side of the images of presidents. We have a library program with the American Library Association to donate suffrage-related books to 6,000 libraries across the United States who need those books. We have podcasts being created as we speak for both children and adults. And we have a number of places across the United States like Nashville, Seneca Falls, right outside of Washington, D.C., where we are building statues and memorials that will be finished, we think, by, even despite all the delays, that will be finished by the end of August 2020. And then people can enjoy for many, many years after 2020 and hopefully serve as an educational reminder for the importance. Certainly, I think we take voting in some ways for granted because we've all been alive when women have had the right to vote, when you're able to exercise the right to vote. But certainly what I've learned from being on this commission and understanding the history of women's suffrage is that a lot of women and men sacrificed a great deal for me to have the right and the ability to vote. So I exercise that option when it's provided to me, and I tell people that I hope that they do so as well, because others spent time in jail, they were ridiculed, they were not viewed favorably for many, many decades before the 19th.
And they had tomatoes thrown in their faces.
Yes.
They would speak and they'd throw tomatoes at them.
That's correct. In the early years, that's right. That was very common. And so it's important to think about those that came before us and the great sacrifices that were made.
You know, don't forget, it's probably too late for this, but Belva Lockwood was the first woman to be actually admitted to the I'm sure you've heard of her.
Yes.
With all the research you're doing.
The bar and ran for president too, right?
Yeah, yes, yeah. I wrote about her in my book. About women spanning 17 centuries, and she actually won the electoral votes in Wyoming because she was the first woman. But she was also fought for 5 years for women to be admitted to the bar of the United States Supreme Court. So I hope there's something lit up for her. If nothing else, just a poster of her. I'm speaking for Belva. I've written a Broadway show about it, a musical, that we would put a little light on and put it on the Supreme Court steps for her in August. Because she's left out. You know, you see all these other names mentioned, but she's rarely mentioned. But anyway, I know we've got to let you go. Thank you for everything you're doing.
Thank you. I appreciate it. Thank you very much.
Today was quite amazing. I hope everyone enjoyed it. I surely learned a lot about women's suffrage that I did not know. And it just enhances in my mind that women are most definitely smarter than men, and they started later. So we had a head start, and they obviously have surpassed us.
We're not smarter than men.
That's what psychology.
Dakare, you're one of the smartest people I know. So it's definitely not that men are smarter. It's just good to know that women can be included in that realm. And Tova, you're one of the smartest young women I know as well. Lisa too. I just think y'all are all fabulous. Tova, what did you learn today?
Oh, so thank you, Janine. Everyone involved in Constituting America is very intelligent, and I think reflects very well on our country. But I just, the whole time I was listening to it, I just kept thinking about how grateful we are for the people before us who fought for our right to vote, because pretty much every group in America has had someone at some point fighting for them to vote. Even going back to the Revolutionary War, which expanded voting rights from the very, very, very narrow group of elite landowning rich white men to, it was first to non-landowning white men, and then fighting for Black men, and then fighting for women, and then with the civil rights movement fighting to expand votes further. And I just think every one of us, even if you were in the original group that could vote, we just need to all be so thankful to the people who fought for so many years to give us these rights and to not take them for granted, because it's easy, it seems like so long ago, but it really, when you think in the grand scheme of history, in America, women have only been able to vote for the last century. And so we really need to have that moment of reflection that we are so privileged to be able to use our voice in our country and have a say. And so we really should try to use it whenever possible, obviously by voting in the presidential elections. But as we at Constituting America, and especially I know Janine always likes to say, the presidential election is not the only way you can get involved civically. You can also and should also vote in local elections that sometimes have even bigger sway than the presidential election. So voting for your representatives, your mayor, your city councils, even your local school councils. As we know, a lot of people start on the local level. But anyway, it's just so important for everybody to get involved, to be grateful to the Americans that came before us, and to, I guess, pave the way for those who will come after.
Well said. Bravo, both of you. Yes. And as you mentioned that list of things we should be grateful for, I think one of them is that women have a legal say over their children. I mean, to think when you were married, if you were stuck in a really, really bad situation, if you needed to get out of that marriage or get a divorce, your husband would keep all the kids. He'd have the right to say what the kids did. Women had no say, even within the marriage. Even if they loved it, even if it was a good marriage, if the husband, as I mentioned earlier, said, "Oh, I want to just sell my child off," and women had no say over they did maybe in the internal workings of the home, but not when it came to legalities. Y'all want to have any closing remarks, Cathy and Lisa?
Yeah, I would just encourage everyone to go to the website of the Women's Suffrage Centennial Commission. It's very easy. It's just called womensvote.org. Or wait, let me look at it one more time. I think I got that wrong. Womensvote100.org. Women's Vote with no apostrophe or anything, just womensvote100.org, because they've got just fabulous stories on there about all kinds of women. Of course, the women we've heard about so often, like Susan B. Anthony, but many, many other women who were real heroes, and they call them their SUFF, like suffrage, their suff buff stories, and they're really great. So,
well, thank you, everyone. Thanks for joining us today.